Britain is failing to prepare itself for war with Russia, warns Richard Shirreff. Britain must fight a second Cold War to avoid a third World War, he said in widely reported commentary and an interview with The Independent. Britain is not properly prepared to defend itself in a war with Russia and cannot rely on the United States and NATO. So, how quickly must Britain act, and what will it take to effectively prepare for war? So, Richard Shirreff is co founder and managing partner at Strategia Worldwide. After graduating from Oxford, he served in the British Army for 37 years, commanding soldiers on operations or in combat at every level, from platoon to division, and rising to the highest rank before retiring from the Army as NATO's Deputy Supreme Commander Europe. Richard is co-founder and managing director of Strategia, and in 2016, his novel, which is coming to seem increasingly prescient, called 2017 War with Russia, was published in the US, UK, and Poland. He is also an honorary Fellow of Exeter College. I'm delighted you could join us on Silicon Curtain. Thank you to the audience, to everyone who supports the channel and its work and has done so to help the growth of the channel through the year. Thank you to everyone who's become a patron or bought me a coffee, and especially those who are helping with our current fundraising campaign to buy trucks to send to the front line in Ukraine. They're incredibly important pieces of kit at this point in the war. For those who are regulars of the channel, they would have seen the fundraising, the story. We're actually going to drive those trucks over to Lviv, and we're going to film the workshops. They're going to turn them into, let's say, sort of battlefields ready and sort of lightly armored to protect the drivers. Thanks also to everyone who's been helping with the Fund the Film project. We are making a documentary film in Ukraine earlier next year to try and challenge Russian propaganda. So, Richard, welcome back to the channel.
Jonathan, thank you very much, and it's good to be back.
Unusually long intro, I'm afraid, but there's a lot going on, and as you heard, we've got a bit more activist on the channel. We've got sort of stuck in with some of the fundraising efforts, but I think at this point it would seem to be incredibly important to do so. And my first question I'm going to fire at you is: Putin has been doing speeches. Unfortunately, they're usually long, protracted, and rather smug. But judging by the words, parsing the words in his recent speeches and utterances, he seems to be under the delusion still that he is winning. He's claimed that in 2025, their target, their military target, will be to fully occupy all four oblasts, two of which they sort of barely control any of at the moment. Is this landing? Is this understood in Western capitals who are pushing Ukraine to negotiate, possibly at a disadvantage when its leverage in those negotiations is lower? Putin is making very, very different noises.
He is, and I'll come back to that in a minute, if I may. Can I just pick up something you said in the introduction about my piece in The Independent? Um, I wrote a piece in The Independent saying absolutely what you said. Yes, Britain's got to be prepared to fight a second Cold War to prevent a third World War. But in a separate article, an independent journalist said Britain has got to be prepared to fight alone without the United States or without NATO. I fully accept, and I absolutely agree with the line that we cannot necessarily now, particularly under Trump, depend on the United States in future. Europe has got to stand alone. But absolutely, Britain depends on NATO, is an integral part of NATO, and should be leading NATO. So I do not see any form of defense of the transatlantic region, of Britain, of Europe, without NATO. So like to put that firmly on the record, if I may.
Definitely. And we'll come back to that as well, because there's some
Yeah.
interesting stuff around Ukraine there, but we'll tackle that later.
Coming back to your question, what you outline really highlights the extent to which many timid Western leaders have swallowed the Kremlin's information operation line that Russia is unstoppable, that Russia will inevitably vanquish Ukraine, capture the four oblasts over which it has declared sovereignty, although it is making a very, very slow progress, and that Russia is unbeatable. And it's all absolute nonsense. You have to look at yes, and having said all that, Russia has got the strategic initiative. Russia is moving forward incrementally, very, very slowly. Enormous casualties, not only Russians, but now North Koreans in Kharkiv were reported. Um, and Russia is still able to maintain the strategic initiative. Why? Because Ukraine has not been given the capabilities and the necessary support it needs to defeat Russia. Why? Because of this concern by the West, particularly President Biden, I think, about escalation, particularly nuclear escalation, and the buying of the Russian bluff, the Putin bluff about the dangers of if you push us, we'll pull the nuclear, press the nuclear button. And I think that bluff has got to be exposed for what it really is, which is hot air. Because actually, every time there has been some incremental expansion, increase in capability, whether it was tanks, whether it was long-range precision missiles, then Ukraine attacked Kharkiv, and what does Putin do? Oh, he absolutely downplays it. So, this is a classic bully tactic. If you push back at the bully, he backs off. And that is precisely what Ukraine's NATO and Western partners need to be doing.
And I think there's another deeper aspect to this, having lived and traveled in Russia extensively in the 90s and seen, I would say, the sort of graveyard of Soviet ambitions, whether it's abandoned factories or projects that ultimately made no sense but caused, extraordinary suffering and trauma. I came to the realization that there's an arbitrariness associated with tyranny, that often its goals are and its projects are inhumane, capricious, vain, frivolous. They have no basis in economical or rational logic. Democracies, of course, will make mistakes, but they have correcting mechanisms where you can question decisions, or you can even go back and say, actually, that was a tremendous waste of time, energy, and money. It seems that many analysts and many in the media fail to understand that mechanic of tyranny, that ultimately it doesn't have the same logic and it can be absolutely absurd, but that absurdity will not stop it. And I see that in these discussions around negotiation as well. So there was a compelling article today by a European diplomat saying we must stop pushing Ukraine to negotiate when there is no rational negotiator in the camp of their adversary.
I think that's absolutely right. And there's a whole lot there to sort of to tease out. But to your point about negotiations, any attempt to start talking or to discuss negotiations with Russia or a deal with Russia between Russia and Ukraine presupposes a deal means that both sides get something. They don't get everything they want, but they get something. That any talk like that completely fails to understand what Putin is about and what Russia is about. That Putin is never going to give up the idea of subjugating Ukraine completely and of removing it from the map as a sovereign state. And it's not just Putin, it's deep within the Russian DNA. And you know Russia much better than me because of your travels there. But everything I read tells me that Russia has only ever been an empire, will only ever be an empire. An empire is deeply ingrained in its DNA, its nation, its notion of itself as a state. And that if we look at Russian history, it's a history of expansion, of gobbling up neighboring states, subjecting them to colonial overlordship until it overreaches itself and then the empire collapses 1917, arguably 1991. And then it all starts all over again. And we're on it has started all over again. And if there's a negotiation, if President Trump tries to do a deal that, quote, stops the war, it will very likely give Putin pretty much what he wants. And if that happens, it's not going to stop the war. Number one, I don't think the Ukrainians are going to stop fighting because they know that if they stop fighting, they'll die as a country. And as I think I mentioned in the article, I wouldn't put it, I don't think it's impossible that Ukraine could develop its own nuclear capability. If it's left on its own, it could well do that. And anyway, the one thing Putin will do then is to reset his armed forces and have another go when the time is right. And then he will go on until he achieves his aim of securing the Novorossiya, the eastern oblast, maybe the coastline, of putting of so-called denazifying Ukraine, which is a disgusting terminology from a fascist like Putin, in my view, and putting a puppet government into Kiev, which then brings Putin effectively to the borders of NATO.
And so there's no indication, is there, that he actually wants peace? And this is going to be quite an interesting dynamic, isn't it? Because Trump seems to have staked some of his reputation. He's described as a sort of Teflon politician, but he certainly seems to have vested quite a bit of his own personal brand in the idea that he can bring about peace. I think, this figure of, in 24 hours, I'm not sure even many of his supporters take that literally, but and that perhaps doesn't matter, but he certainly has staked, I think, a lot of his administrative, capital on the idea that he can bring about peace. It seems to me that peace is inimical to the process you described as Russia. Either it's expanding or it's collapsing. There's no middle ground. Putin understands that if Russia contracts, then likely that will be the end of his regime and possibly his life. This seems that there's an almost inevitable divergence coming up between Trump and Putin, but we don't know how that's going to play out. Do you have any sense of where that might go?
Well, the risk for Trump, of course, if he does try and stop the war in a day, as he said he'll do, and it ends up giving Putin what he wants and leading to the collapse of Ukraine, is that Trump will be seen as a loser, and that precisely the thing that has marked the Biden administration, the absolute ignominy of the collapse of the operation in Afghanistan in 2021, that stigma will be attached to Trump only 10 times more so. And Trump doesn't want to be a loser. Trump wants to be a winner. And similarly, Trump doesn't like losers and he likes winners. Um, and I mean, any look at Putin and behind the bluster, behind the propaganda that Russia is unbeatable, highlights the vulnerabilities of Russia. The fact that Russia is a loser, that Russia has lost vast numbers of its young men thrown away on the rubbish heap of the meat wave attacks. And you've only got to look at recent events in Syria to see the extent to which Russia is a loser, and that this particular Ozymandias absolutely has feet of clay.
Well, we're going to come in a second to British preparedness, and that seems to be quite an interesting and complex topic. But the last question I have, a debate has blown up. There's someone who comes on the guest very frequently. I have huge respect for his opinion. Someone called Anders Puck Nielsen, and he did an interview or an episode which went sort of viral, where he said this invasion is not about territory. And then, talked about and dissected various things. It's about, the regime change, control, new world order, etc. But then Putin comes out and says he wants to take four more oblasts, and he seems to sort of stake this reputation on a very territorial ambition. Is it useful at all to try and parse these, or are Putin's motives kind of multi-layered? It's about territory and everything else at the same time.
I think the latter. I think absolutely the latter. I mean, I think ultimately this is a war not just against Ukraine, it's a war against the West. It's a war against Ukraine joining the West and the notion of the West as well. It's a war that, again, the point we just want to pick up. There's not only an imperial driver here, but there's a criminal driver, in a sense, the nature of the Putin regime. And I know this is something that Bill Browder will talk about in much greater, very articulate, in much greater depth than I could do. But the nature of the regime means it's got to maintain forward and momentum. This is a corrupt, kleptocratic regime. And the only way Putin can consolidate his position is by continuing the movement against Ukraine. And then when he's finished in Ukraine, move against other states as well. So criminality, kleptocracy, corruption uh, is interwoven into imperialism as well, into a pretty toxic a toxic mix, I think.
Well, let's turn to the UK because, of course, your marks that garnered quite a bit of attention about preparedness. And actually, I've heard, this Chatham House event, this is one area where there was quite a bit of diversity, I think, of opinion. Some saying, yes, NATO could repel a Russian conventional attack, etc. It's been overblown, overhyped, etc. Then someone who, again, whose opinion I put a lot of store by, Keir Giles, says that actually we are woefully underprepared, even to tackle Russia in its current weakened state. And that's before you even get into the ability to tackle hybrid warfare, electronic warfare, sort of modern combined arms that includes drones and the various techniques that are being, used in Ukraine or innovated in Ukraine. What is your take? How unprepared are we? And how many different fronts do we need to start making developments and investments on to secure our defense?
Well, short answer, woefully, and every front. And anybody, in my view, who says that NATO is prepared and ready to take on a Russian assault is in cloud cuckoo land. And I think it's and of course, there will be those who would say that, wouldn't they? Because they are the people who don't believe that we need to spend anything more on defense. Now, I think the mechanics of how you spend on defense, I mean, they're not straightforward. But the reality is that if Russia, let's just roll the clock forward 4 or 5 years, and Russia had at some stage, as I postulated, achieved its aims in Ukraine, had built up its armed forces, had continued to build up its war economy, and was able to then decided to bite off a chunk of the Baltic states. It would not be difficult for Russia to really put Britain under the most extraordinary pressure. For a start, where is the air defense? Somebody once said to me, a civilian friend said to me the other day, presumably London is protected by an iron dome system such as Israel's. Well, I mean, of course it's not. It's absolute, cuckoo land. There is nothing. If you compare this to the late 1930s after Munich, when the air defense and the RAF was expanded, and you'll remember that the notion of the bomber will always get through. So measures were put in place. Now they weren't necessarily terribly successful in the Blitz at air defense, as you only had to look at from the photographs, London destroyed. But the fact is that there was an effort to try and address the problem, and the RAF was in a position to defeat the Luftwaffe in the Battle of Britain. I don't think there's any way that Britain could withstand the sort of level of attacks by missiles, by drones, that Russia has been able to launch at Ukraine. Now, of course, it's much closer. Yes, they're neighbors. But the fact remains that the Oreshnik missiles, hypersonic, are able to reach, they're within range of UK. Where is the ability to stop that? And then let's suppose that there was some sort of reinforcement option to bolster up the defences in the Baltic states. Well, the fact is Britain has got an enhanced forward battle group of some just over 1,000 in Estonia, round about maybe 900 Brits, in the face of the sort of concentration of force that Russia has demonstrated it could do in Ukraine. And if in 5, 10 years' time it tried to do it in Estonia, I think there's very little chance that it could do very much. It would be cut to ribbons. And then you'd be dependent on a reinforcement capability. Right now, Britain would find it extraordinarily difficult to generate a warfighting brigade, let alone a division. It's going to take years to be able to generate a division in land systems terms. So I think across the board, and then whether it's offensive capability, whether it's defensive capability, air defense, whether it's civil protection, civil defense, whether it's resilience, whether it's a whole lot of things, all the mechanisms that were put in place, not perfectly, but they were pretty reasonable. They were probably 70% solutions in the Cold War, would need to be put in place if Britain was ready for war, to be ready for war. And we haven't even begun to talk about the mobilizing of defense industries, developing a war economy, generating the equipment needed, the ammunition, the logistics needed. So I think we're in a really bad state. And you know that it's in stark contrast, frankly, to our allies in the east, like Poland, like Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, the other Baltic states.
Finland, even Sweden as well,
Finland, I mean,
Denmark.
Finland, I think, is a
But,
brilliant example of a country that is a thriving, very successful democracy, a very, very effective Nordic economy, but it espouses ruthlessly the principle of total defense. Conscription, universal male conscription. If you see what the capabilities that the Finnish army have got, they are way ahead of the British army. I mean, the Finns from their conscript force, as a result of conscription and that huge pool of reserves that they've got, could generate in short order 200 of the very latest mark of Leopard 2 tanks ready to fight. Britain couldn't begin to generate 200 tanks ready to fight in less than, goodness knows how long it would take, but it would take, I would say, a year or so to get into that position. So we've got a great deal to learn. And what I find just so absurd, really, is British politicians telling other allies that they need to increase defense spending. I mean, how can you look at yourself in the mirror when you're saying that sort of thing and think that we are in any way, shape, or form ready for war? Now, all credit to our defense secretary who has said we're not ready for war. At least there's a bit of straight talking at a senior level in politics. Absolutely similar. The veterans minister who said recently the other day that the British Army would be cut to pieces in 6 months. I think he's optimistic. I think it would be rather like, it would not be unlike the first Battle of Ypres in 1914,
6 weeks, 6 days,
which
yeah.
saw the end of the British Expeditionary Force. So there is realism, but that realism and acceptance of realism is not yet being translated into, action this day, as Churchill would have said.
And this is the basic stuff, which one assumes that if the bureaucracy was to start sort of grinding the gears, it's not simple, but at least it's, artillery pieces, tanks, etc., etc. The trouble is, it seems that there is innovation that's going on, and not just innovations in drone warfare and the multiplicity of arenas in which drones and roles they play on the battlefield, plus the sort of air defense, which now is like a combined arms of air defense, where you're being attacked by drones to test your systems, to deplete your patriots. Then the different classes of missiles come in to sort of, test the systems to the limit. But also the fact that in Ukraine you have an alliance, as it were, in some areas. I know it's patchy, but you'll have tech entrepreneurs working with people on the front. They're innovating drones, drone warfare, and technicalities, and then developing cottage industries out of those. It's an incredibly rapid cycle of innovation, deployment, testing, and then tweaking, and so on. And it's continuous. What's the challenge there? Because that's more of a culture systemic challenge, which it seems to me, and I've put this question to a bunch of people who don't seem to have the answer on this. How would our bureaucratic mindset and our bureaucratic structures actually adapt to what is the fastest scale of evolution in warfare techniques that perhaps has been seen before?
I think that's another key area. I mean, I just want to be clear that I think the nature of war, as we're seeing it fought in Ukraine, still requires equipment and capabilities which have stood the test of time on the battlefield. Tanks, armored infantry, fighting, self-propelled artillery, armored engineers, air defense, and the like. But there are other 21st century dimensions as well, which are critical. And as you've laid out, I mean, this is a drone war. It's a war of it's high tech. And again, here, this requires the ability to harness the ingenuity, which is in this country in abundance. I would highlight, for example, the Defense Tech Hub set up in Kiev when I visited it in March last year, just opened, called Brave One. Now, Brave One, the idea is that and it's run by a bunch of pretty young people, civilians. You go into their offices, it's a bit like a sort of what I imagine a Google a sort of Silicon Valley with colored beanbags and, all sort of young 30 somethings. But their focus is on taking the ideas, battle winning ideas from the kitchen, the workshop, the garage, and getting them onto the battlefield as quickly as possible by linking them up with investors, accelerators, the Defense Ministry, the Ministry of Digital Innovation, the Treasury, the Ministry of Finance, and the General Staff. And when I questioned them about the sort of timescale that they were talking about for an idea, getting it from idea to the battlefield, the young woman who runs Brave One, Natalia Mikulska, said, "Well, she said, I think about 7 weeks." Well, you go and tell that to the UK Ministry of Defence, the Pentagon, or or the Ministry of Defence in Germany. I mean, we can't think like that. We've got to think like that. And we've got to develop the sort of agility. What was interesting as well, though, the key metric of time was not so much how long it took to get onto the battlefield, but how long the Russians took to develop a countermeasure. And that means that you've got to put in place the capabilities to push that Russian development of a countermeasure out clearly as long as possible.
It's an
So,
iterative cycle, isn't it? Which is
yeah.
much more like, as you say, the Silicon Valley ethos. You put stuff out there, you test it, you get your data, but you have to move rapidly on a kind of iteration cycle, which I would imagine is alien to a lot of the large procurement processes around defense equipment.
I think sadly it's too much the case, and you've only got to look at some of the, frankly, procurement catastrophes of recent years to show that there's an awful lot that needs to be done to really harness the ingenuity that's available in this country. But it needs incentive as well, and that's it needs, and all this stems from really bold political leadership and a clarion call to say the top priority is defense of this nation right now. How are we going to do it?
And there's another interesting development, I think, which again is perhaps even more challenging to traditional military ethos, and that is, I mean, I'm going to do some interviews in the new year with Ukrainian journalists and activists about the persistence of the Soviet mindset, because I know we say a lot of things about Ukraine, but there's a real problem with a resurgence of the Soviet mindset. And a lot of people with this sort of tech background and the sort of Maidan activists, unfortunately, a lot of them are dying. And Russia has already killed a lot. So there is a sort of resurgence taking place of the rather bureaucratic counter innovation thing. So that's another conversation. But when it works, there's something rather interesting going on, which is people get the choice in some instances of which battalion to join. And if you are someone who is bright and innovative, you'll gravitate towards battalions that have that more open culture. They're less hierarchical. You know that you can put an idea forward and you're not going to get absolutely slapped down for it. Whether it's a good idea or a bad idea, you'll be able to pass that up the chain of command. The idea of introducing Maidan style, almost sort of representative democracy into the structure of a military and allowing people to join battalions and have that freedom to do it based on, judgment of criteria of how effective is that battalion, what training does it offer, how innovative is it. This is quite an alien concept, I would have thought as well, in the traditional, army structure.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty alien. I mean, I wouldn't say it's the notion of listening to soldiers and getting views is alien in our culture, because it's not. Because actually, in my experience, the best way to try and harness good ideas was free and open discussion among the staff, and then at the end of it, when you've explored ideas, that's when the commander's got to say, right, that's the idea we're going to go for. Right, let's get on and make it happen. Um, I mean, as far as Ukraine's concerned, I can't say much except that, my goodness me, they've done, it's been a valiant fight, an absolutely valiant fight. We haven't given them what they really need. There has been, from our perspective in the West, a failure of strategy there. There has been no strategy. As long as it takes, support as long as it takes is not a strategy, it's a slogan. And in my view, if a strategy to defeat Russia in Ukraine had been adopted and implemented right from the very start, we would not be where we are now. But Ukraine's also got to look to its own organizations as well. And I mean, again, I don't want to be judgmental in any way, but clearly the issues of mobilization have, in a sense, a failure to mobilize as extensively as they might have done for understandable reasons, because they wanted to protect the youngest from the ravages of war, perhaps. But at the end of the day, this is an existential fight. And when the nation is threatened, its existence is threatened, well, it's a case, in my view, of all hands to the pumps, as
It's
it was,
difficult, isn't it? Because
as it was.
there's a demographic issue as well. If you look at the population bell curve, you can see why they're doing it. If they were to drop it down to 18, they would have a future demographic catastrophe if you know that generation was whittled out. It's a really tough one, isn't it? But they've also pointed out, I don't know, because I get the impression that Zelensky does not lie, but you may not necessarily get the whole picture, and that's true of any government, politicians, of course. But he has said that they have a number of battalions which they could deploy right now, but they are under-equipped. And he's thrown it back at Sullivan and others, saying, yes, you're telling us to drop that age, but the guys we already have are under-equipped. We're not going to throw in more meat. We're not going to become Russia. What's your, I mean, do you know what's going on there, or what's your impression from the outside of
I,
this tussle?
I can't, I really can't comment on that. But what I come back to my point that I can comment on, which is that if a properly thought through strategy to support Ukraine defeat Russia would have involved not only the provision of equipment, ammunition, logistics, but also the transfer of knowledge, of understanding in terms of command and control, and how to fight large formation warfare. And then the training of it and the practicing of it as well, rigorous training, which is why I'm delighted that there are suggestions, for example, as we saw in the papers yesterday, about British soldiers training forces in Ukraine. But here we are. We're 3 years too late. We're 4 years too late. Arguably, actually, we're 10 years too late, because this war started in 2014 and we should have been doing this. We should have been doing this from the very start. And if we had done it from the very start, arguably we could well have deterred the attack in 2022.
And in terms of our capability, we've talked about it being woefully unprepared, but if we are to help enforce at least some sort of temporary peace or frozen conflict scenario, what do we actually have the capability to do? Are we far better placed to perhaps impose a no-fly zone rather than being able to put mass boots on the ground? Or is it in the training capacity that you've mentioned there? There's also an interesting sort of subtext, which is tech transfer, which actually we may still have some strengths in there. It's been said that a prototype of Dragonfire may have been transferred to Ukraine, which is now forming the basis of them becoming only the fifth nation in the world that could have a laser-based air defense capability.
Can't comment on the latter. I watch it with real interest, but I can comment on the notion of implementing a ceasefire. And I don't think those who are talking about freezing, I mean, for example, JD Vance's suggestions from a couple of weeks ago, that they'd freeze the war where it is, and turn to the Europeans to provide a monitoring force. This is a 1,200 or 1,000 kilometer front, if not a bit longer. I don't think the notion of putting in place, if you are to put in place a monitoring force, it has got to have real clout, it's got to have real teeth, it's got to have combined arms capability, and it's got to be prepared to fight to implement it. I don't think anybody who's commenting on this has any idea of the sheer scale of the numbers required. An example, 1999, KFOR in Kosovo. There was no war. There wasn't a war going on. The Serbs got out. Yeah, there was some nasty sectarian stuff with the Serbs attacking the Kosovo Albanians attacking Serbs, and they needed to be protected and defended. But even then, KFOR was round about, when I was a brigade commander in KFOR from February to July 2000. KFOR was about 50,000. You go back to the implementation force in Bosnia, 96, similar numbers, possibly even bigger. Uh, if you've got the sort of war that's been taking place, of the viciousness and the ferocity of the war that's been taking place for the last 3 years in Ukraine, and you are trying to put an implementation force, you're talking about, oh goodness me, 500,000 at the very least, with all the long-range precision missiles, the surveillance capabilities, the strategic enablers, and this to be provided by the Europeans. I mean, come on, it's just not going to happen. So I think that, we've got to be really realistic about this, and all this all then plays back into, will any such ceasefire stick? I think it's highly unlikely.
And this plays into the debate about NATO as well. And this, again, was an interesting area where a number of the speakers who aligned on almost everything would start to sort of, come apart, or divisions would show up in their discussions at Chatham House. And this is on the likelihood of NATO, one, Ukraine joining NATO, and I think those like Keir Giles are saying, look, this is simply not going to happen. We need to look at more realistic solutions because it can be blocked by Hungary and any number of people. And even then, as a consensus-led organization, are the security guarantees that it can offer? Yes, they've held for Western Europe up until now, but would they hold for Ukraine against Russia? And there are some concerns there. Something like perhaps the Joint Expeditionary Force, something that is a coalition of far more inaction nations, far more aligned on the threat that Russia poses, might be actually a far more effective vehicle. And then, of course, there's discussions around nuclear umbrella. But all of these are fraught with political complexity, but also with my cynical hat on. I'd say, well, how many of these would Putin look at and genuinely be fearful of? It's very difficult to say.
I think I think we've got to look at this strategically. Let's think about what the threat to Europe is long term, as we've discussed. The reality is that Russia will continue to be a long-term threat to peace and security in the transatlantic region. That it will always pose a threat to Ukraine, and once it's achieved its aims in Ukraine, it will move on. It will move. It's already moving on in Moldova and Georgia by hybrid asymmetric means and manipulation of elections. But it would almost certainly want to move on into the Baltic states or ever, because of that dynamic of the criminal, corrupt, kleptocratic, and imperial regime that has got to maintain forward dynamism if it is to survive. So what? How does Europe protect itself? The only way Europe is going to protect itself is through NATO. NATO protected Europe and the transatlantic region in the Cold War, the last Cold War. It is going to have to fight another Cold War, as I've already said. And the only way that Russia is going to be deterred is with a band of deterrent steel from the Baltic to the Black Sea, with Ukraine as a member. Now, however difficult that is, that's how you get there. But the strategic goal must be to achieve that. And I prefer to think right to left on these areas, because that's what strategy is about. Where do you want to be? What's your goal? Right. What are the objectives to achieve the goal? What are the pathways to get to that goal? Now let's start devising decisive conditions that need to be achieved as you move down that pathway to your strategic goal. The fact is also that no other security guarantee will do. Look what happened to the Budapest Memorandum of 1994. It was meaningless. The JEF, well, I mean, the JEF's a tactical organization. I'm sure it's a jolly efficient organization. But is it really of the scale, the size that is going to be needed to provide security guarantees, which means deterring war, which means being prepared to fight Russia? No, it's going to require boots on the ground, NATO boots on the ground, and it's going to require NATO aircraft in the sky above. Now, of course, all sorts of obstacles on the way. You mentioned Hungary. Other Putin supporters or close, potential allies so-called allies who might be pretty close to Putin. But these are issues that have got to be resolved. But a first thing is to understand where you want to be and what it is that is going to provide peace and security in the transatlantic region. not just for our generation and our children's generation, but our grandchildren and theirs, because this is a generational challenge. This is not going to go away. It's only going to go away when Russia reforms itself and becomes a responsible member of the international community. When Russia gets rid of its imperial hang-ups, when Russia recognizes that empire is not the be-all and end-all, and it's inimical to its own survival. I'm not sure that's ever going to happen. The only ways you're going to achieve that with Russia are either you do to Moscow what was done to Berlin in 1945, and that, of course, is never going to happen, or Russia, like some alcoholic recovering, having hit rock bottom, asks for help, and that's not going to happen. So I think I come back to the only realistic thing, which is a strong NATO able to deter. Now, of course, easy to say strong NATO. What about America? What about Mr. Trump? What about Trump saying he would encourage any NATO, Russia to attack any NATO member, quote, if it didn't pay its dues? You can't rely on America. So Europe's got to step up to the mark and do it on its own. And this is the wake-up call that should have been happening the moment it was clear when the polls closed on that first morning after the US election. We knew Trump was in the chair from the 20th of January. There's a lot of talk about it, but where are the politicians saying, let's get a grip about it and make it happen?
And hoping this will all go away seems to be the very foundation and cornerstone, unfortunately, of Western response. And
Well, I would
what,
say, I would also say, hang on, actually, just to qualify
yeah,
that real, they get it in Eastern Europe. Of course they do. The Poles, the Baltic states, they absolutely get it. But it's the big democracies, the big economies of Europe, Britain, Germany, France, Italy. The fact is, there are five G7 members, the G7, the so-called richest democracies in the world. There are five, excluding the USA, which are NATO members: UK, Germany, France, Italy, and Canada. They should be stepping up to the mark in exactly the same way that our friends in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland are stepping up to the mark, and Finland and Sweden.
and they recognize the threat. And, I don't want to sort of necessarily malign all politicians because they may see the threat, but find it difficult to sell it to their electorate. But Russia has seemed to fall into a pattern of increasingly reckless behavior. You have Iranian shaheeds, hundreds per week, hitting European territory. You have North Korean troops on the continent of Europe. Potentially, they haven't appeared on Ukrainian soil, sovereign Ukrainian soil yet, but that's not precluded at all. That would be seen as a significant escalation beyond what they've already done. You've had incendiary devices in DHL planes. There is the potential that the plane that actually crashed may or may not have had one of those incendiaries on it. You've had attempted assassinations and actual assassinations. An extraordinary campaign of absolute recklessness. Is there a chance that through hubris, miscalculation, or just the sheer aggression that we've seen, that Putin in the coming year, rather than, peace and negotiation, which everyone's hoping for, may actually trigger a direct confrontation, a direct war with Europe, whether he means to or not?
Never say never. Never say never. There is absolutely the chance. Um, I mean, I think you highlight the ever-present reality of asymmetric hybrid conflict, which is happening now. You talked about the DHL warehouses, the plane that crashed in Lithuania could well. This is absolutely par for the course with Russian military doctrine. The shaping phase under the threshold of conventional war to undermine the integrity of your target states or states so that when you do launch conventional war, they fold more quickly. Manipulation of minorities, arguably the interference in the Brexit referendum and the Scottish referendums of 2014 and 16, good examples of that. Cyber warfare, the interference allegations of interference in the presidential election in the US in 2016. Surveillance, the the drone activity in Eastern England recently, drone activity in New Jersey recently. What are these drones doing flying around air bases? I suspect they could well be looking at, they're conducting reconnaissance. They're looking at where the married quarters are, where the F-35 pilots live, and preparing all that so they've got the data. And it's don't you buy a drone for for 100 quid from your local carriers or something like that, and any Russian sleeper could be doing that. And we've got to be alert to all this. So and we've had clear warnings from the head certainly of the UK's interior internal security agency MI5 saying that this is a real and present threat. Dmitry Trenin, who used to head up the Carnegie Moscow Center, man with very close links with the Kremlin and a former senior Soviet army officer himself, wrote in 2016, "The Kremlin has been at war with NATO since 2014. Not conventional, but unconventional, hybrid asymmetric, and that is continuing to this day. And if given a chance, and if push came to shove, I think the prospect of the sort of Putin launching a direct attack, I think, is minimized and reduced by the reality of the extent to which he is fixed in Ukraine. But given half a chance, given a break, given a ceasefire that allows him to reset his armed forces, it absolutely goes up rocketing in probability.
The very last question here, and this is one that sort of perplexes me slightly. Um, this is a discomfort that has been expressed at the very surgical assassinations or taking out of two Russian senior military staff in the last week. Quite clearly, this is Ukraine operation. I mean, it couldn't be anything other than that in this case. Other assassinations are questionable. This one certainly. But these were serving competence, both linked to war crimes with compelling evidence, but they are combatants in a genocidal war. But there seems to be, I mean, yes, we expected howls of outrage from the Z Patriot community. That's partly because their impunity is being challenged for the first time. Some sense of justice or accountability is being meted out to them, and potentially by implication, it could happen to them and the Tsar whose orders they follow. So that's kind of amusing to see that and the dynamics of that. But why would people feel so uncomfortable and condemn? I know they call it assassination, but essentially, my understanding is that perfectly legal in the context of war, because these are combatants and demonstrably, may well have committed war crimes. People might feel perfectly comfortable about, say, carpet bombing a city, and yet when it's an individual in these circumstances, suddenly that's not acceptable. What's your view on the validity of this and indeed the effectiveness of such a strategy?
Well, I'm not losing any sleep over it at all. I think they had it coming to them, and good for the Ukrainians, frankly. Um, I think we've got to remember. Again, I go back to the great Winston, who said he's got a quote for everything. He said, the Russians only understand strength. Where they find weakness, they will probe, and they will continue to probe. Where they find strength, where they see strength, they'll back off. This was Ukraine demonstrating strength, and it was absolutely good news.
So, Richard, always a massive pleasure, and your forceful insights are very, very welcome indeed in the current circumstances. Thank you so much for coming onto the channel, especially at such a sort of busy time of the year. It's massively appreciated by myself, and it will be, of course, by the audience as well.
Jonathan, thank you very much for having me, and keep up the great work.